Alright, so let's talk about Photon Blast. This video is a little bit out of order. If you saw my Glisten revisit, actually I had shot this and kind of thought about this before that video. So if I'm referring to things that seem a bit out of order, that's why. But anyway, we're going to talk about Photon Blasts. We're going to talk about the data that came out later last week, get a better understanding of not only how Photon Blasts work, but also how you can take advantage of it using the Techter skills Awake Yell and Elemental Weak. Let's look at the data sheet. Of course, that'll be in the link below, and understand how to analyze and assess Photon Blast generation and also Photon Blast down accumulation, both physical and element. So if we look under the generation column, specifically PB, we can see for wand, this will be for every weapon, but we'll just focus on wand for now. Every attack has a Photon Blast generation potential or unit. So if we look at step attack, 6, so on and so forth. And of course, the most important thing to call out is how Photon Blast generation works. And as we see in the bottom note section, it takes about 540 seconds or 18.5 generation per second if you think of PBS units to hit your Photon Blast gauge max, or roughly 10,000 to charge. This is important because when we start thinking about Techter skills, Elemental Weak, and Awake Yell, we can then understand how much value we're getting out of those skills in comparison to the values we can get from our weapon attacks and just our Photon Blasts naturally charging. And so first, let's get a better understanding of Elemental Weakness and Awake Yell, and then we'll go into some runs and showing those effects and proving this data out. But essentially, Elemental Weakness, for those who may not be familiar, when you attack an enemy's Elemental Weakness, you will get upwards to 10% to 20% of that Photon Blast, additional Photon Blast unit. So essentially, your Photon Blast unit is, 10 per attack, 20% is going to net you 12. Now, of course, I'm talking as if Techter was your main class. You'll need to make those adjustments if it's your sub. Awake Yell isn't attack dependent, it's really just time dependent. And Awake Yell essentially says when you are against a tough enemy or a boss, so think about a veteran or a UQ boss or a gigantic, your rate of Photon Blast increases upwards to 20%. Instead of 540 seconds or 9 minutes for that Photon Blast gauge to increase, 20% of 540 seconds is 108 seconds. So you're looking at almost 7 minutes to charge. So you can imagine when you take that into account, you're automatically shaving off 2 minutes when fighting a boss. In addition to Elemental Weak, if you can use it properly, it can cut your time down considerably. How much? That's what we'll get into. But first, let's go through some runs and let's make sure that this data is correct. So a few things to call out in this run. It's not going to be exact just because it can be very tricky of when to start counting the Photon Blast gauge when it's gaining. As you'll notice that immediately when you teleport into a map, it's starting. So I'm not too sure if it's starting before the load or starting after, but we'll get a sense of exactly what's going on. In addition, what we're also going to see is that when I do Awake Yell testing, I'm starting after a Photon Blast. So I might be off a little bit just because I'm not too sure when the Photon Blast starts gaining after you use your Photon Blast. Fortunately, in this run, I was able to get Ulan to stop attacking. So essentially what we're seeing here is we're just seeing the difference in charge times. I've got Awake Yell at level 4, so that's plus 18%. So it's not going to be the full 108 seconds decrease. But essentially this run is going to show us what happens when you have Awake Yell active versus just normally gaining your Photon Blast naturally. As we can see, there's about a 15% difference if we do the math. Now, once again, I'm going to take some variability into account because not too sure when I should have started the counter. 15%, and we can probably say, hey, it's 1 to 2% off. It's not an exact science. The data checks out more or less. You know, it takes about 540 seconds or 9 minutes for it to charge. Awake Yell is going to knock that down considerably. So next, what we're going to look at is elemental weakness, and it's going to be at level 2. So as a Techter main, that's going to be at 12%. Let's see how much additional gain we can get. Okay, so there's a lot going on here because I was doing a lot of different tests, and then I discovered something in one of the tests which led to the Glisten Revisit videos. This is where I get into why things are out of order. But really what we want to pay attention to is the Photon Blast gauges for each of these runs and just seeing how it increases over time. Not worrying about too much of which comes first, which comes second, which comes third. That's just kind of getting into this comparisons between Glisten Sword versus Glisten Wand versus Resurge with Lightning Photonic Furies, but not a big deal. Really what we want to see is, all right, after using a Photon Blast, how fast during this Daedal or Daedal fight do I get my second Photon Blast? And to agree, how much after getting that second Photon Blast and using it, how much more do I get working my way to a third? So as we can see here, when using Photon Blast immediately, we can get another Photon Blast in under 3 minutes. Once again, this was Elemental Weak level 2 or plus 12%, and Awake Yell level 4 or plus 18%. So the time would be a little different if we increased Awake Yell to 20%, but not too much. And if we looked at Resurger, even though of course the fight took longer, so this makes perfect sense, but essentially it got about 40 to 50% of an additional Photon Blast gauge for its potential third PB. So you can start seeing that if you're able to use a Photon Blast immediately, you can probably get 3 Photon Blasts within 6 minutes, if not a little faster, giving certain effects in the attacks that you're using, so on and so forth. Now, which one should you max? For me personally, when we look at the wand data, we now have a better understanding of how elemental weakness works, and it's essentially adding a percentage based on the PB per hit that you get for each of your attacks. So if we were to look at basic attack, it's only 3. So if we think about 20%, that goes from 3 PB to 3.6 versus putting 1 point as a Techter main and getting 3.3. At the most, I would say if you wanted to be efficient, putting no more than 2 points into Elemental Weak versus Awake Yell, where because it is a flat decrease of 540 seconds when you're fighting a boss, that 20% is almost 2 minutes down. But specifically, if you look at it in 10% intervals, that's 54 seconds every 10%. I feel like that is giving you more mileage than maxing Elemental Weak, especially since Elemental Weak is 10 points to max out to get that 20%. You know, 12% versus 20%. When you look at each attack, it's not really moving the needle. I don't think you're going to get as much value maxing that versus focusing on Awake Yell. Now, I do have a final test, which is really not PB dependent, but really understanding how does Photon Blast work for wand. As we see in the sheet, it says it gives 60 plus 270, but of course it's more than 60 because wand PB hits 6 times, but it gives the same amount of physical as it does element. My question was to determine, does that require Photonic Fury, or is this basically all the elements regardless of what the status of your wand is? And so this is what this next run is going to be, to confirm whether or not you need to have that particular element to cause it down, or does the wand Photon Blast do all elements when it comes down to its down accumulation? So now let's get a few things out of the way about this test. We've got 4 trials or 4 runs, but there's really only 2 different conditions. So on the top, you're going to use the Resurge wand with wand Photon Blast to start the fight. The bottom two runs do not use the wand Photon Blast to use to fight, just to get a sense of what might be happening when it comes to physical downs and elemental downs, and how is wand Photon Blast influencing that. Now, there is a specific difference between the Resurge wand Photon Blast condition. The first trial uses lightning photonic fury activation while using the Photon Blast. In the second trial, I'm using fire photonic furies. After that Photon Blast is used, I then switch to lightning. So what I wanted to see in this situation is, does the photonic fury influence the element of the Photon Blast, or does it not matter? And so really these runs are to see, do Photon Blasts, specifically for wand, supply every element, or is it dependent on the photonic fury? What did these trials show us? Looking specifically at the wand Photon Blast trials, or our top two trials, what we see is that no, photonic fury does not influence the element down accumulation that is caused by that Photon Blast. Essentially, from these two runs alone, we can confirm that Photon Blasts do every element. If they didn't, we shouldn't see similarities, or we shouldn't see that the lightning wand PB underperformed the fire. Now, why do we see differences between the times when it comes to shock? That's likely due to me getting better over time with countering and attacking Daedal. So essentially, if I were to do everything perfectly, we'd probably see the similar times in shock, other than Daedal's attack patterns changing. More importantly, when we look at the non-Photon Blast runs, their shock times are fairly similar. Now, you're probably looking at that second trial and being like, no, it's not. That shock is 3 minutes and 16 seconds. That's way slower than the others. But what I want to point your attention to is the stun time, which is very close to the shock times of the other runs. And essentially what we're seeing is that when you are not using Glisten and your attack patterns change, it can be a coin flip depending on whether you get stunned and whether you get shocked. One of the things that you can't see in the videos, because I sped them up super fast, when you down Daedal, the world doesn't stop. What I mean by that is down accumulation is still triggering. The tricky part is that once Daedal or Daedal recovers, it takes about 17 seconds before you can trigger another down. So when Daedal or Daedal downs or gets stunned or even shocked, there are 15 seconds before he recovers. And then there's about another 2 seconds before he starts attacking again. So you can imagine within those 17 seconds, I could have stunned or shocked Daedal. And essentially what happened was, in that run, that second trial, I just so happened to have more down physical accumulation than shock. And it could have literally been a coin flip to where I didn't do enough parries, I didn't do enough wave crashes, I did something different that put physical down accumulation in front of shock. But when you reduce that time difference by 17 seconds, you start seeing that, oh, they're pretty much all within the same realm. If you shock, your stun is going to be delayed by at least 15 to 17 seconds, and vice versa. But looking at this data all together, we can see that no, Photonic Fury or your wand element does not influence your Photon Blast. When you do a Photon Blast, all elements, fire, ice, lightning, and in the future, wind, light, and dark, they are all applied as down accumulation equally. In closing, now that we have a better understanding of how Photon Blasts work in of themselves, but also the interactions with the wand skills, the Techter skills, kind of gives us a sense of when we are maining Techter, how do we want to think about using our Photon Blast? One of the common behaviors that I've noticed is that people generally tend to save their Photon Blasts until the target downs themselves, just because the target is down, whether it's shock or stun or any other element. Especially as Techter, you get that additional 5% damage. That seems to be the ideal time to use your Photon Blast. But given the speed that Techter can increase its Photon Blast rate, I would say using your Photon Blast during a down state isn't necessarily the best idea, even if it does net the most damage. Essentially, because of how fast Techter can use Photon Blast and use that in combination to down the target, it feels like you want to use your Photon Blast as soon as you get it. Unless you're going to use it in a situation where you're either going to miss or it's not going to be as effective due to whatever the situation is. Because you can down your target faster, all you need to do is find a suitable photon art, for instance sword, street caliber, to use during a down state. Will it do more damage? No. The question you have to ask yourself is, how much damage potential am I gaining because I'm building up down accumulation that much faster using the Photon Blast as quickly as possible? And how many Photon Blasts can I chain in a fight? You can imagine in a 4-minute fight, you can get off 2 Photon Blasts. As the fight begins to increase in duration, 3, potentially 4, depending on the health of the target. How fast does that lead to elemental or physical downs? If you say you have 3 downs versus 2 downs, even though you're not using that Photon Blast during a down state to maximize that damage, you have an additional down. How much more damage can you do from that down? And does that decrease your time overall? And I would say in most situations, it likely does. As we saw, looking at those last 4 trials, using a Photon Blast downs your target about 15 to 20 seconds on average, and of course that'll change given the situation, but 15 to 20 seconds faster, and potentially depending on the Photon Blast and depending on the conditions, even potentially 30 seconds faster than not using it. So you're downing your target 30 seconds faster, you're able to then do down damage faster, and potentially build up another Photon Blast to do additional damage, and potentially another down during that fight. So those are things to think about. Definitely those are things to experiment with, see what works best for different enemies, as I'm sure the enemy that you're fighting is going to vary that a little bit. Other than that, hope that was helpful. Hope you enjoyed watching, and until next time, when there's something else we can experiment with as they come out, and we'll go from there.